American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 8, The Mass Media and Politics. In this segment, we'll be considering the learning objective of recognizing how the media influences the interpretation of political reality. So when we consider the mass media, we have to consider that there are multiple functions that it plays in the political system, and it's a story that oftentimes has the influence on the policy that comes about. So taking this into account means that we have to consider how the media directly influences politics. First, the selection and then reporting of the news has the first and most important impact. But beyond that, this is the interpretation of news, the framing of the news that plays an important role in how it influences citizens' attitudes and their behavior. And finally, as a result of all these foregoing, it sets the agenda for government action. So let's take a look at the selecting of the news, or the news priming. Here, the media stressing certain issues can affect the public's perception of political events and politicians. But the key thing is, when you emphasize one issue, others are ignored. This is because there is only a finite amount of time or space that we can spend on any one topic. So there is choice. So one way of looking at this is put very well in the book when it comes to how the press engages in agenda setting. The book states, while the press might not be very good at telling people what to think, it is stunningly successful at telling them what to think about. This priming also leads to media influencing the criteria by which people judge policy issues. Again, according to the book, there is virtually no way to statistically distinguish between the prominence of an issue's coverage in the media and how important the issue is ranked by voters. In other words, what the voters see in the press oftentimes determines what they think is important, so it influences the criteria by which people judge the importance of policy issues. So let's take a look at the next step, which is the making of the news, the framing. Framing refers to emphasizing some aspects of a story over other aspects. This in turn influences the interpretation of the story itself. Now, it can be overt and obvious, such as editorial content, but it can also be quite subtle. In other words, how the story is told, the media bias influences how people respond to it. So this framing can be cognitive, what is described, or it can be affective, how things are described. In other words, the way things are presented to you can influence how you process them. If there's a negative affectivity attached to a certain person by the use of words, this can influence how people perceive that. But even beyond that, how things are visually presented can have an influence on how people process it. And this is where a lot of my research has gone over the past few years. Now, the pioneers in this field, and the big names, are Betsy Grabe and Eric Busey. And in 2009, their Image Bite Politics, News and Visual Framing of Elections basically set the standard. And here they talk about different ways by which the video editing that goes on with television news influences how people perceive politicians as well as public policies. For instance, we have the Goldilocks effect. The idea here is that whoever has the final speaking turn has greater authority. In other words, they have the last word. Lip flap, on the other hand, is when you show an individual speaking on the news, yet the reporter is doing a voiceover. What happens here is that the individual who is speaking while the reporter is doing the voiceover is seen as awkward and unworthy. It's almost like you're being talked over, and people just don't want to listen to what you say, but are listening to someone else. Now, the shot length also has an influence. So, for instance, if we have an extreme close-up, which we show the face only, this is a personal space invasion. You are in that person's face, and this can be quite intensely disagreeable to people. On the other hand, the close-up where you see the face and the shoulders, This has a level of visual intimacy that is much more socially acceptable. And so when we have this with politicians, we can form a greater affective bond with that individual through the mediated platform of television or the internet. Now, the medium range, where you see the face and the torso, suggests a personal relationship, yet there is still a certain amount of distance from you. Whereas on the long range, where you have the full body, this creates personal distance and thus moves the viewer away from the person who's being shown on television or the internet. Now, the camera angle also has an influence. So, if you show a high angle where the camera is looking up at someone, this gives the person that's being filmed power and authority. Whereas, on the other hand, if the camera angle is looking down, this diminishes the stature of the individual being filmed. And this is something that we intuitively come to appreciate because as children we look up to our authority figures. Yet when we get older, we use this size and even aim for higher buildings or standing on hills or whatnot to assert our authority. Now, the camera movement also has an influence on how people perceive candidates. Zooming in other words, moving towards an individual suggests that there's an intimacy, there's a desire to move towards them, which is an innate human activity, as is zooming out, moving away from an individual, which is the creation of distance, which might be saying that I want to push away from this person. So subtly, there's a nonverbal cue that might influence us in these different manners. Now, the eyewitness approach, in other words, the shaky camera, the perspective taking approach, gives us a you are there sort of perspective that is very popular with the found footage movies that are right now. And part of this, as we can see when we go to these movies, leads to a much greater feeling of emotional connection and emotional response to these movies. American national government.